Hello and welcome everyone to another Solarplaza webinar. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Technical University of Munich. During today's webinar, we will hear about the economics of converting renewable power to hydrogen from Gunther Glenk, a PhD candidate at the Technical University of Munich. Gunther has also recently published a paper on this topic if you are interested to find out more. I'm Mina Mesbahi, a research analyst with Solarplaza, and I will be moderating today's webinar. All right, so starting with why we're here today, the promise of hydrogen has been around for many years, but lately the progression seems to be ramping up. With its potential to decarbonize the industry, hydrogen can be the missing link in the chain of energy transition, especially the hydrogen generated by electrolyzing green energy. All right, and that's why we will take a closer look at the economics of converting renewable power to hydrogen during today's webinar, as I mentioned, to see how far we are from the cost-effective green hydrogen, or are we already even there? Gunther is here today to tell us all about it. Okay, so before we start, I'll take you through the agenda and some practical details. All right. Okay, after a brief introduction about the future grid labs, we'll go into the presentation and answer any questions you may have later on at the end of the webinar. All right, so what are the future grid labs about? This coming May, we'll be hosting the second series of our FG labs in collaboration with Deloitte once again. We'll go in depth in 3 half-a-day programs. On the 17th of May in Rotterdam, the first lab is happening about hydrogen, where we will explore the complete value chain, including the state of the current market, the applications for industrial use, residential use, and transport. And finally, we'll take a look at the policies around hydrogen and a roadmap to so-called hydrogen economy. Moving on to the second lab, on the 24th, we'll take a closer look at the transition to a circular economy, and then, of course, with a focus on the energy sector. And last but not least, we'll zoom in on customer centricity, how to deal with the, democratization of the energy sector and the rise of prosumers, and how businesses adjust their business models to these changes. Make sure to check out our upcoming webinars on these topics, as well as we gear up for each lab separately. All right, so now let's move on to the practical details. Please use the chat box should you run into any technical issues. Happens sometimes. We're here to help you with that. As I earlier mentioned, we will also dedicate some time at the end of the webinar to do a Q&A. You can use the question box on your screen to submit your questions at any point during the presentation. Webinar recordings and slides will be also available for download after the webinar. So without any further ado, let's get started with the presentation. Gunther, thanks for joining us today. I'll hand it off to you.
Hello. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, we hear you well, Gunther. Please continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining today. The numerous attendance shows me that all the work was not just an academic exercise, but is indeed relevant. Actually, last week at an event on global cooperation on hydrogen at the German Ministry of Economics and Energy, I was greeted with the sentence, the author of the famous paper that was recently published. Well, that was very nice to hear, of course. It turned out during the day that really not everyone had heard about the paper. So I guess I should have replied in the beginning, so it was you who read it. Now, today I would like to introduce you to the main insights of this paper, Economics of Converting Renewable Power to Hydrogen. If you have any questions, please comment them in the box and then we can get to them at the end. Good, thank you. To mitigate global warming, the transition towards sustainable energy systems emerges really as a central obligation of the world economies. The good news is we seem to have developed the backbone of decarbonization. Wind and solar energy sources are becoming the cheapest option for power generation with 2 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour in more and more geographic regions. This chart here that you can see was recently published by the oil and gas company Shell and illustrates nicely the impact of renewables. we can see that renewables will undoubtedly replace fossil fuels as primary source of energy, not only in the power sector, but also in heat, transportation, and industrial processes. However, the switch to wind and solar power entails two critical challenges that have remained unsolved thus far. First, wind and solar power generation is contingent on highly intermittent natural conditions, which endangers the reliability of energy supply. And second, decarbonization must go beyond the power sector to other energy sectors, in particular transportation and industry. Thus, overall, there is a pressing need for energy storage and conversion. Now, the public debate often jumps to the conclusion that batteries will do the job. They can power cars and homes and balance short-term fluctuations in the grid. But batteries are also limited in their applications. If we want to be serious about deep decarbonization, we also need a form of chemical storage, like hydrogen. Before we proceed, let me ask you, what do you think is a promising application for renewable hydrogen? Is it A, feedstock for chemical and processing industry? Is it B, energy storage for power generation? Or is it C, fuel for transportation? Or is it actually all of the above? What do you think?
All right, let's see how people vote. We'll wait about half a minute so everybody gets a chance to vote. But sort of, what do you expect to see based on on your experience? Which option do you think most folks will go for?
That's actually an interesting question. I mean, mostly people have hydrogen in mind when it comes to transportation. They have heard about hydrogen cars, and then typically they argue, oh, hydrogen cars are definitely out of business. We all have electric cars now, like meaning battery cars. But often transportation is not only cars. Yeah, there are many other types of transportation. Trucks, for example. What do you do with them?
Absolutely, you're right. Yeah, so let's take a look at actually the poll results.
Good. I mean, the question was not too hard, I guess. All of the above is indeed the correct answer. So we can now proceed. Actually, I'll elaborate on all of these options so we can proceed with the presentation.
Excellent. Continue, please.
Quite right. So it's all of the above. Hydrogen can be used for a range of applications. For power generation, hydrogen has the advantage that it can be stored at large scale in tanks, pipelines, and caverns, similar to how we store natural gas today. That allows us not only to store electricity over months and seasons, but also to ensure a reliable power supply for periods of low winds and little sun. And it also allows to import electricity, or actually energy, from other continents or other areas where they have a better renewable solar irradiation, for example. Let me make an example. So Japan can import energy in form of hydrogen from Australia, Europe from Saudi Arabia, for example, or Northern America from Chile or so. Now, for transportation, hydrogen appears a suitable replacement for fossil fuels, especially in long-range applications such as airplanes, ships, trains, and trucks. Just 2 days ago, I talked to a couple of engineering professors again, and they said there's absolutely nothing in the pipelines of today's laboratories that we can fly airplanes on batteries for long distance. So we have to go on some chemical form of energy storage here, and hydrogen seems promising. And for industry, hydrogen is already an input factor for ammonia and could be used for steel production, chemicals and electronics, as well as a replacement for natural gas. There's also a growing political interest in hydrogen, and I already mentioned those bilateral relationships between Japan and Australia, but also Germany, France, UK. They're very interested in producing hydrogen in Europe and also importing it from, for example, Saudi Arabia. Now, hydrogen has actually long been heralded as a key to a carbon-free economy, but widespread adoption has so far been withheld by our inability to produce the gas without emissions and at low cost. Now, in our paper, we examine the economics of converting renewable power to hydrogen. We develop a model framework from the perspective of a corporate investor that applies to a general hybrid energy system in any jurisdiction, for example. Specifically, the investor considers combining a renewable power facility with an efficiently sized power to gas facility. Our main question is, when is renewable hydrogen production economically viable? The renewable source can either sell the generated electricity to the electricity market or convert it on-site to hydrogen, which is then sold off to the market. Since our interest is in renewable hydrogen that does not cause any atmospheric release of CO2, we focus on electricity obtained purely from a renewable power source. Now, on the next 2 slides, I will briefly introduce you to the mechanics of the model that involves some math, but is also the most precise way of identifying the relevant parameters of this valuation. For each equation, of course, I will explain the intuition behind it. Now, consider a hybrid energy system, combining a renewable energy source with a power to gas facility. Without loss of generality, we can normalize the capacity of the renewable energy facility to 1 kilowatt and assume we can scale the renewable source linearly to however large the solar farm or the wind farm is. The inherent intermittency of the renewable source is captured by the capacity factor CF of T, which measures the percentage of utilization in any time T. At each point in time, the electricity generated can be sold at the current market price, PE, or it can be fed to the power to gas facility for conversion to hydrogen. The investor and operator will seek to optimize the utilization of the available capacity by maximizing the contribution margin in real time. Now, the capacity size of power to gas is the scalable variable KH, given in kilowatt of electricity absorption. Selling hydrogen yields a conversion value of hydrogen denoted by CV of H, which consists of PH, which is the price of hydrogen per kilogram. WH are the variable costs for consumables like water or some oils and whatnot, also per kilogram. And then eta, which is the conversion rate, and that has 2 benefits. First, it captures the efficiency of the conversion, and second, it converts the value of hydrogen or the price of hydrogen in euros per kilogram to a value of hydrogen in euros per kilowatt hour that we then can directly compare to the price of electricity. Now, a facility earns a conversion premium whenever the conversion value of hydrogen exceeds the electricity price. Or in other words, whenever the electricity price falls below the conversion value of hydrogen. And one last important factor is the amount of conversion. The conversion is limited by either the capacity factor of power to gas or the hourly renewable energy generation. We capture this by the Z of TK. Now, taken all together, the contribution margin can be expressed in this equation that you see here in the middle. And the interpretation is that basically the contribution margin equals as if we would sell all the renewable energy to the market plus a conversion premium whenever hydrogen is more valuable. Now, this is very important in the economics, you see, is the real-time operation of the hybrid energy system. Now that we learned about the contribution margin and basically the revenues of such a hybrid system, let's look at when we would invest in such a facility. And with that, we can move fast towards answering the research question of when renewable hydrogen production is economically viable. At the top equation, you see the net present value of a hybrid energy system that can be expressed here as a profit margin of renewable energy and the profit margin of renewable hydrogen production, which is the right part. The profit margin of renewable energy is the average electricity price, PE, which is adjusted by this factor gamma, and this factor accounts for the covariance of renewable energy generation and electricity prices. For solar energy, for example, solar power facility peaks during the day, clearly, when the sun is up high, and electricity prices also typically peak during the day. So this covariance factor would be greater than 1 and improve the value of solar. While for wind, is typically actually the other way around. Wind peaks during the night when electricity prices are also lower, but not in all geographic regions. But in Germany, for example, it is the case. And the profit margin also entails the levelized cost of electricity. You're probably very familiar with this. The levelized cost, just briefly, is the unit cost of all resources required over the lifetime of a facility to deliver 1 kilowatt hour. Now, similarly, the profit margin of renewable hydrogen production is the average conversion premium, CPH, multiplied with the factor that accounts for the covariances between the conversion premium and the amount of hydrogen conversion, minus the levelized fixed cost of hydrogen, which is multiplied by this amount of power to gas facility installed. And this levelized fixed cost of hydrogen is similarly calculated as the levelized cost of electricity. It is a unit fixed and capacity related cost of hydrogen production. Now, renewable hydrogen production, we refer to it as economically viable if the net present value of an optimized hybrid energy system is positive and exceeds the value of a renewable energy source on its own. And you see it here. KH star is the optimal power to gas capacity, and combined size must exceed the net present value of only the renewable energy source. And 0 here is the lower bound due to the option not to invest at all in the beginning. We refer to the lowest hydrogen price, for which this inequality still holds as the break-even price for hydrogen. Now, the two systems, renewable source and power to gas facility, can be combined in two ways depending on the standalone profitability of a renewable energy source, so that we receive two findings that can be stated compactly in terms of average unit costs and revenues. Let's look at the first one on the left. If the renewable energy source is profitable on its own, a necessary and sufficient condition for renewable hydrogen production to be economically viable is that the conversion premium exceeds the levelized fixed cost of hydrogen. Thus, that means to know whether to invest, we only have to compare these two average values. In the first step, we do not have to know how large we should build each capacity. Only in the second step, we would evaluate what the optimal capacity size of power to gas is in relation to the renewable source. The simple condition can emerge because the factor Z is increasing and concave. What does that mean? Simply, when we increase KH, the size of power to gas, from 0 to 1, which is basically the percentage in relation to the renewable source, the costs increase linearly, which you see here on the top right. The costs increase linearly, while the conversion premium here increases up to a certain limit that is given by the amount of renewable energy produced and the level of electricity prices. Now, going on the right side, conversely, if renewable energy source is not profitable on its own, a necessary condition for renewable hydrogen production to be economically viable is that the conversion premium exceeds the levelized fixed cost as well as the standalone loss of renewable energy. Now let's see whether I was able to deliver the key insight on the model framework. What do you think are the two important drivers for the competitiveness of renewable hydrogen production? So A, real-time operation and relative size of capacity investment. B, cost of water and other consumable inputs. C, cost of hydrogen storage and transport. Or D, heating value and weight of hydrogen.
All right, let's see. The polls are open now. Let's see how actually people respond. How do you feel about this one, Gunther?
I'm actually curious. I've not asked this question before. I think it should be clear.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Got some smart folks in the room, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you should be fine. Let's see. All right. Still people voting in.
I do sometimes get the question, yeah, but what about the cost of water? I mean, it would make total sense to install such a facility in the desert where we have lots of sun.
Yeah.
But there is no water. And actually, even there, the cost of water is not high enough to really make a difference.
We do have some water-related questions actually coming in. So as a reminder for folks also to, submit their questions still if they have any. All right, so let's check out the results.
That is interesting. And that was also a small trick. I see that 2/3 and the majority here is right. Real-time operation and relative size of capacity is what I was aiming for with my question. Because we are talking about hydrogen production. Answer C, cost of hydrogen storage and transport, is of course a relevant question and a relevant driver, but it's not relevant for hydrogen production itself, right? Right now we're talking about production. If you then have the hydrogen and you got to transport it to a hydrogen customer, then of course these costs are relevant. But also, as we get to it later in the numerical evaluation in a minute, it is actually very important that you can install such hybrid energy systems on site or close to a hydrogen customer so that you can basically mitigate those storage costs. Okay, let's continue then with the presentation. In the second part of the paper, we apply a model framework to Germany and Texas. Both jurisdictions are exhibiting a rapid growth of renewables. And for hydrogen prices, we know that it's important that a hybrid energy system can frequently be installed on-site or adjacent to a hydrogen customer. So the benchmarking hydrogen prices are then those for industrial hydrogen supply, which is today produced from fossil fuels. Right? So in our logic, the first goal is to replace hydrogen that is used today but produced from fossil fuels with renewable hydrogen. And then basically once we have that, or in parallel already, we can integrate new technologies that switch from some other energy source like natural gas to renewable hydrogen. Our data inputs are from peer-reviewed journals, journal articles, publicly available reports, and interviews with industry experts. We also use industry databases such as ABB Velocity Suite, and for electricity prices, we basically make use of the wholesale market. The calculations use the latest historical data and are implemented using MATLAB. Now, before I show you the results of our calculations, let me say two more things. First, on the left, you see our main input variables. Overall, you can see we use average numbers. There's nothing too optimistic. And second, on the right, you see an illustration of how the German subsidy for wind energy affects power to gas. Germany offers feed-in premium for per kilowatt hour. In its current form, this premium is paid only for renewable electricity fed into the grid and therefore imposes a prohibitively large opportunity cost for on-site conversion of renewable power. In our calculations, we assume that the current feed-in requirement will be waived and the same premium will be credited as an equivalent production premium, as we can actually observe it in Texas. Texas has a production tax credit that is paid irrespective of whether the electricity is fed into the grid or not. Such a policy change would be supportive of the frequently discussed goal of connecting the different energy segments, also called sector coupling, such as electricity, heat, and transportation. Now let me show you our numerical results. Our calculations yield break-even prices of €3.23 per kilogram in Germany and $3.53 per kilogram in Texas, which you see on the very left side of each chart. These prices for renewable hydrogen production are cost competitive with small and medium scale, but not with large scale fossil hydrogen supply. Now, what are examples for those hydrogen supplies? Examples for small and medium applications include the production of chemicals and metals, such as steel. And large-scale production includes fuel for shipping, oil and gas refinery, or ammonia production. Now, in comparison to earlier studies, we obtain way lower break-even prices, in large part because our calculations are based on power-to-gas facilities that can, one, operate in real time, and second, are sized optimally in capacity. Now, recent historical developments suggest improving economics for renewable hydrogen production. The calculations yield a development of break-even prices for hydrogen through 2030 of what you can see here. The central finding is that renewable hydrogen is projected to become cost competitive with large-scale fossil hydrogen supply within the next decade. The solid line, the solid blue line here, assumes a medium convergence of the levelized cost of electricity and the electricity prices, and the shaded blue areas are slower and a faster rate. In the chart for Texas, you see a hump, and the hump in 2020 reflects the anticipated phase out of the production tax credit for wind power, which basically increases the standalone loss of wind energy, so that the price of hydrogen must be higher to compensate the standalone losses. Now, you're probably also very interested about some policy recommendations, or what are some policy implications. Recall that our findings for Germany are based on a policy change that would waive the current feed-in requirement for renewable energy and replace the feed-in premium by an equivalent production premium. Policymakers could also accelerate the emergence of renewable hydrogen production by a straight rebate or an investment tax credit for the investment in electrolyzers. Such rebates and investment tax credits are actually widely in place already for solar electricity or for batteries. You can see the S-chip program in California, for example. Now, assuming that we can transfer such a similar rebate transfer it on electrolyzers, power to gas plants, you receive those dotted lines. The illustrated by the dotted lines, we find that for rebate increments of 10%, the break-even price for renewable hydrogen accelerates their competitiveness with large-scale fossil hydrogen supply by about 1.5 years here. Now, the last and final quiz: in what applications can renewable hydrogen be cost competitive today? What do you think? Is it A, shipping fuel, B, oil and gas refinery, C, chemicals and metals production, or D, ammonia production, which is basically fertilizer?
All right, the poll should be open right now, so feel free to submit your answers. All right, so let's give it a few more seconds so we can have a more accurate representation. All right, I think we're ready. Let's take a look.
That is interesting. Now, actually, you may be right with answer D, ammonia production. If you have electricity, for example, from pumped hydro or from some dam, where you can produce electricity very, very cheaply for 1 cent or so. In the case of renewable hydrogen production from wind and solar electricity, we're not quite there yet, based on our calculations. Ammonia production is part of the large-scale hydrogen supply, which means that renewable hydrogen production would be competitive within the next decade. Chemicals and metals production is part of the medium and smaller scale applications for hydrogen. And this is the industry that we could target today. Renewable hydrogen production is cost competitive for medium and small scale applications today. So we can target chemicals and metals production. Certainly, the very large CO2 emitters are found in the large scale applications, which are shipping fuel, oil and gas refinery, and ammonia production. I guess we'll have to wait a little bit for that. And yeah, good. So we can, the only thing that I will do now is to conclude. Let's see. Yeah, thank you. Oops. Yeah. So we can observe that wind and solar energy is becoming the new primary energy source for a low carbon economy. There are two important challenges. One is the intermittency of power generation, and the second one is widespread decarbonization. Hydrogen is a promising solution that can solve both challenges, and recent cost reductions in renewables and power to gas technologies suggest economic opportunities. Now, what we do in our study is we develop a generic framework from a perspective of a corporate investor. Our main question is the economic viability of hydrogen from renewable electricity. And the main driver of economic viability is real-time operation and optimal relative capacity sizes. In our numerical evaluation, we find that renewable hydrogen is already competitive with medium-scale fossil hydrogen supply. And if the learning curves, the cost reduction of recent years, if they continue in the coming years, renewable hydrogen is also competitive with large-scale supply within the next decade. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Gunther, for the very thorough presentation. We really appreciate you being with us here today. We can now open up to a Q&A. All right, let's begin with our first question. Can the natural gas pipelines underneath the ground in various European countries, such as the Netherlands, be used to transport hydrogen? If so, what are the challenges involved with this? So what do you think, Gunther?
Yeah. This is actually a very important question. And at the current stage of research, we know that we can feed in at least 10% of hydrogen into the natural gas pipelines. And in some areas, some people even say we can at least feed in 20%. When I started 3-4 years ago, people said, oh, 3 to 10% max. But now we're already at 10 to 20%. But the amount of hydrogen that we can feed in is subject to ongoing research. It very much depends on the corrosiveness of hydrogen. Hydrogen is also a smaller molecule than the methane, which is basically the largest component of natural gas. So it's important that all the valves and all the tubes are sealed or more dense than and basically can contain the hydrogen. And then it's also a matter of purity and how consumers of electricity that are consumers of natural gas that are connected to the gas pipelines, how they consume it. Is it just for heating? Then it shouldn't be a big problem. If it's a chemical industry and they use the natural gas as an input factor, then they want it as pure as possible. So we really have to still figure this out, how much hydrogen we can feed it in. Generally, it shouldn't be a problem to have a system where we can transport hydrogen. We can observe pipelines in Texas and in the UK, for example, was based on hydrogen in decades ago. Then they switched to natural gas. So generally, it's not a problem. How much we can blend hydrogen and natural gas is subject to ongoing research.
All right, thank you for the very informative answer. We do have quite a few safety-related questions. I suppose the gist of it is sort of what are the safety concerns for hydrogen? And yeah, so how do you evaluate that? And is it highly dangerous and whatnot? People seem to to have quite a few concerns on this.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts?
So basically, this is actually a widely spread perception that hydrogen is extremely dangerous. And I think that comes from the Zeppelin exploding and everyone thinking about hydrogen being so explosive. But it's a gas like natural gas as well. It's just as explosive as natural gas. When I talk to engineers about the security or the safety of hydrogen, they always say it's not a big issue. The only difficulty maybe is that hydrogen requires more volume than natural gas. We'd have to compress it more in order to store it in the same place, right? So it's easy, and since it's a smaller molecule, it's easier for hydrogen to escape from wherever we capture it. And if then there is anything that that could inflame it, then of course it's dangerous. But it's the same issue with natural gas. Per se, the gas itself is not more dangerous.
All right, I hope people are less concerned now about the safety issues surrounding hydrogen. You mentioned, I think, density quite a few times. We have another question that says, since hydrogen is so dense, does this mean that all of the fuel tanks of hydrogen cars have to be adjusted? If so, how costly will this be? And will it actually be possible to produce these cars on a commercial scale?
Mm-hmm. So for hydrogen cars, or generally hydrogen can be very suitable for long-range transportation. And for cars, for example, we can easily fit enough hydrogen in existing hydrogen cars and existing hydrogen tanks to drive a car for 600 to 800 kilometers. So it's further, definitely further, almost 1.5 to double this the distance that a battery electric vehicle can drive. And if we build a larger tank where we have the space for in trucks, for example, or in trains, it can go even further.
All right, thanks for answering that one. In the presentation, you mentioned that for assets such as hydro dams that provide very low electricity prices, green hydrogen is more economical. In countries with large hydro and nuclear resources, wouldn't it make more sense to produce green hydrogen from these assets and scale up and down according to wind/solar coming into the grid?
Certainly, you can combine an electrolyzer with any electricity source, and of course, for hydrogen to be renewable, it should be without carbon emissions. And an important parameter in the economics of hydrogen is the cost of electricity. And if the electricity price is very low, then it can also work with hydro dams. Or with nuclear, but typically actually nuclear isn't so cheap. Maybe on a variable cost, nuclear electricity is very cheap, but if you include the capacity investment into the electricity price, nuclear is not cheap at all. Nuclear is actually a very expensive power source because it's just too dangerous and requires too much investment to maintain and keep it safe. Renewables are becoming so cheap and that it would make more sense to combine with renewables.
Indeed, nuclear is seemingly cheap. All right, so another question we have is, how scalable is hydrogen production? Are the examples of two-scale production, for example, enough to substitute a coal-fired station? And how controllable is the heat in hydrogen production currently?
So power-to-gas facilities can be or are actually quite modular. You can scale them up as much as you want. Typically, a power-to-gas facility comes in a sort of a shipping container, and then you can scale it as much as you want just by buying more of those shipping containers. And we observe that probably in the future we will have two kinds of hydrogen production. One is more is actually a regional hydrogen production, which is then maybe more medium and smaller scale, and the other one is just ultra large hydrogen production, where you basically plaster a gigantic area in some desert or some wind offshore area with renewables, and then produce hydrogen. And then actually you have hydrogen so cheap that you can afford the transportation cost to then ship the hydrogen to another area. That could be the example of Australia producing hydrogen for Japan, or Saudi Arabia for the EU.
All right. So with that, we have another vehicle-related question. So what about the infrastructure to refill your vehicle with hydrogen? None is in place. What kind of requirements and investments would there be?
Yeah, we will have to build hydrogen stations, gas stations. That is definitely new infrastructure that we need. Well, just the station itself, we may be able to reuse some natural gas pipelines. But the stations themselves, we have to build new, well, at least the spending, those, how do you call it? Basically the machines where you can get the hydrogen out. You can, of course, use existing gas stations in their locations, but you'd have to build new dispensers for hydrogen. The benefit definitely is that you can charge a hydrogen car, so to speak, within seconds or minutes, just like a normal regular car. Right now, you don't have to wait for a half an hour or 1 hour like you would have for battery vehicles.
All right, there are many more questions coming in, but I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we'll do just 2 last questions and then we'll wrap up the webinar. All right, so could you give us some examples of small-scale applications for hydrogen production?
Yeah, so small-scale application for hydrogen production, you would have, for example, a solar panel on your rooftop, or multiple solar panels on your rooftop, for example, a large storage facility for a warehouse, for example, or some production. And then you have your shipping container for hydrogen production on the side. And that company may use the hydrogen for electronics production, or in the food industry you need hydrogen, or in some smaller pharmaceutical companies you need hydrogen, or it could also be that you run your warehouse equipment, for example, forklifts, that you run those on hydrogen. Of course, you could run forklifts also on batteries, but then it's actually not the direct comparison of the battery forklift, the cost for battery forklifts and the cost for hydrogen forklifts, but the driver here is the drivers of those forklifts. If you have batteries, you may have to charge them, and then your driver has some downtime. Or if you don't want your driver to have some downtime, you have to have more of those battery-driven forklifts and more equipment overall.
All right, and then the last question is, do we have enough water to cover all of our energy needs with hydrogen?
I would say yes, because we can also desalinate the water, desalinate seawater. I just talked last week to people doing that already in places where it's very hot, down in South Africa, and they said the desalination of seawater is definitely feasible and is not a big cost driver of that.
All right, thanks, Gunther. So this brings us to the end of today's webinar. The webinar slides and recordings will be available for download shortly. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and also give a shout out to my colleague, Marco Dortal, for managing this webinar behind the scenes with me. We very much look forward to seeing you again in another Solarplaza webinar, and we wish you a pleasant day. Thank you.
Thank you.